Medical references in Greek literature are definite and clear. Magical references, however, require pulling back the veil to reveal the ancient secrets of the Greek inner sanctum.
Cannabis and other recreational drugs were used to create a gateway through which a person could communicate with the divine. And these gateways were the most famous oracles of the ancient world.
So cannabis would have been known by other names. It's inconceivable that the Greeks wouldn't know about cannabis since it's a common weed.
So one of the drugs that the priestesses use to burn on their altars are forms of incense that have cannabis in them.
It was also commonly available as an additive to wine.
Cannabis, like sex, are taboo topics. Drugs and sex drugs are taboo topics that we don't talk about in classics today.
The myths and philosophies of ancient Greece have influenced Western society and sciences in many profound ways. Considering the metropolitan nature of Greece, it would be hard to believe that they too would not have come under the spell of a magical plant that was clearly so popular in the ancient world and surrounding cultures. Especially considering that Egyptians, Persians, and Scythian influences on Greek culture are well documented. The general view for decades among Greek historians in regards to cannabis is generally limited to the view that there are a few sparse quack medical references and an account from Herodotus regarding its use by a foreign culture. Alternatively, in his chemical muse, Drug Use and the Roots of Western Civilization, Dr. David Hillman suggests that cannabis and other psychoactives played an important role in ancient Greece, and as he explains, there is another possible reason why there is so little written on the subject.
Modern scholars don't have the scientific expertise to be able to identify different species of plants and the chemicals that were in these plants. So there's a lack of expertise within classics. Not many classicists also studied biology. So there's no overlap. There's no interdisciplinary overlap. So classicists tend not to study these documents. They're very difficult to understand, first of all.
As Hillman has also noted, the main obscuring factor in regards to the role of psychoactive substances in the classic world has been the intervening 1700 years of institutionalized Christianity. These originally religious prejudices, with the passage of time, became cultural prejudices, and then later academic prejudices.
And that, when we look at this through the Christian lens, that once the Christians took over Western civilization, there's a way of looking at things that changes, and you can see this in the way that the plant is interacting with the society.
Yeah, they don't understand the references when they appear,
right.
And because of cultural prejudice, they don't want to discuss it.
Correct.
And recognize the influence of it.
Correct. Nobody will really understand the history of cannabis until we can look at it through their own lens. And modern classicists are unwilling to do that. Studying drugs like marijuana is strictly taboo and forbidden.
A view Hillman is far from alone on, as can be seen in the pioneering work of Professor of Classical Studies at Boston University, Carl Ruck.
and it is a topic that classicists find too hot to handle. They don't know about it, and secondly, they don't want to know about it because it is taboo in our present society.
Fortunately, a new, more enlightened age of Greek studies is upon us, and as Dr. Hillman, Professor Carl Ruck, and Dr. Marguerite Rigaglosio and other scholars are starting to demonstrate that there are clear indications the Greeks were fascinated by the magical properties of their botanicals, and there is evidence that cannabis and other substances played a prominent role in such applications, and moreover, in the cults of deities and Greek heroes such as Apollo, Aphrodite, Orpheus, Hera, and others.
So cannabis is used both as a medicine in Greece and as a drug that facilitates the religious experience. Cannabis was a very common ancient drug that was never vilified for it being unsafe for the general public. It's used by half the population, the women, all the time. And in addition to that, it's being used in ritual to carry out incense, the offering of incense.
Cannabis was probably always an ingredient in the incenses that fumigated sacred space in classical Greek and Roman sanctuaries.
After inhaling cannabis fumigations, the Greeks believed that this process helped them to visualize the goddess. Cannabis is typically used in the temples of Aphrodite, where the statue doesn't speak at the ceremony, but during a dream incubation. And the form of the cannabis they're using is what is squeezed off the bud.
The general view is that cannabis came to the Greeks via the Scythians, and this was the view in ancient Greece itself. The Scythian method of using cannabis by placing it on hot coals in enclosed tents has been discussed on Burning Shiva before, and this ancient nomadic horse-riding culture has been widely credited with spreading the use of cannabis throughout the ancient world.
Agatharchides tells us that cannabis comes into Greece probably from Scythia. Did he know? No, but he's basing all his knowledge upon the fact that he's a drug trafficker. He carries drugs between ports. So he knows where drugs end up and where they come from, what their native regions are. And that's why Agatharchides is guessing that this means they came from Scythia, because we all know that the Scythians actively use these things in their own religious practices. So you have Herodotus. That's how we think that the Scythians were so involved with the use of cannabis. Because we have Herodotus telling us this story about the Scythians who would light cannabis seeds or parts of the plant, and that they would vaporize, and they would sit on their hair, and they would become jovial. Yeah, Herodotus talks about that. Yeah, so it's not, there's no surprise that Herodotus doesn't say this is a shocking thing that those Scythians would sit around and get, you know, but this is what they like to do. They like to have these little get-togethers, and they pull something over them, and they inhale this stuff. They hotbox together a little, in a little Scythian tent, and they get all, you know, stoned.
Archaeological remains have confirmed the existence of such funeral ritual among the Scythians.
The record of Herodotus about the Scythian use, we don't know whether he actually ever saw such a ceremony or not, because that wasn't his technique. He just gathered information. And the strange thing about his mention of the Scythian tent ritual is that he seems to indicate that the Greeks don't know about cannabis. So he explains that it produces a cloth that's as good as linen. That may be simply that he doesn't know anything about plants or isn't interested in plants. But when Herodotus is describing the Scythian fumigation tent ritual, he compares the way the Scythians come out of the tent howling with the same kind of intoxication that wine induces.
The Scythians, with their smoke ritual, we like to think they were far away, but they're not. They weren't. But in particular, they were actually a familiar feature in Athens of the classical period. They were hired as mercenaries to supply the police force.
Now, think about Herodotus and the other historians of ancient Greece coming together and discovering the Scythians, discovering the Proto-Iranians, and talking about the history of marijuana with them. There's even a point at which Herodotus was simply not believed by his peers, by his contemporaries. They thought he was making stories up. And what it did was everybody in ancient Greece read Herodotus. He was their primary historian, and not only did the Greeks read him, but many of the surrounding areas, right up to present-day United States, rely on Herodotus. So, these Scythians, which the Greeks called skutoi, and are also known in the Far East as Saka, conquered an enormous space, but they were nomadic, so they didn't establish administrative centers, like was done with the Incas in South America, for instance. But they were travelers, and everywhere they went, they influenced the use of bong and spread the use of bong. And when it came into Greece, it had to fight with wine, which had been accepted and was never very much accepted in ancient Greece, with one exception. There was something called potamurgus, which people don't know what was involved with the recipe for that, but may very well have involved bong. And it was used as a sacred libation in many, many practices. And that probably came from them, although it had been by that time converted from smoking to the drink that is so popular.
Well, they found, besides the bronze cauldron, they found Scythian vessels that were contained cannabis, and there's evidence of cannabis-infused wine amongst the Scythians as well. And also, when they started preparing these beverages, they took the cauldron shape that had been used for the burning of stones
and used that as the shape for the beverage.
Yeah, in order to describe a link.
The strange thing about cannabis is that it doesn't enter the botanical medical writings until quite late.
Where cannabis didn't make its first appearance in the classical pharmacopoeia until the 1st century Common Era in the Medical Encyclopedia of Dioscorides. And unlike entries for other psychoactive plants like mandrake, opium, and datura, it does not have a variety of magical other names suggestive of its involvement in myth and religion.
And that is strange because Herodotus made it known about 100 years before Theophrastus, who was our first source, and he doesn't even mention it at all. It obviously has to do with the fact that they called it something else. When it finally is called cannabis in Dioscorides, it appears without the mythical environment that would indicate that it has magical properties. He is apparently unaware of those properties. He calls it skoinotrophlon because you can twist it to make rope.
A reed twine for its common use in manufacturing ship cables.
An asterion, which may have mystical connotations, but it also could just describe the shape of the leaves. It resembles a star. It's only late that we get information indicating that it alters one's sense of well-being. It causes hilarity, and then it's being used as a recreational drug. And you have to understand that the ancient botanists were polymaths, which meant they just copied from each other. They didn't judge what they were passing on. That wasn't their task. If it was ever written down, it was knowledge. And so they incorporated it. And the more books they read, the wiser they were. And so you have a compendium growing of misinformation about cannabis. So in addition to when they finally record that it causes hilarity, you also find that it grows in the deepest forest, which is not true, that it has an unpleasant smell. People debate that, but most people find it a pleasant smell. And the medical applications are ridiculous. It cures flatulence. We don't know whether it does or not. And earache, especially worms in the ear. I doubt that that's the case.
Nor did they know correctly what parts of the plant are chemically active. It is not until the 2nd century that a confused notice about the plant's intoxicating properties entered the medical writings.
Clearly, cannabis had a place in the Greek pharmacopoeia. Thus, it would be curious that a plant with combined medical and psychoactive applications would escape the more magically minded members of the society.
Since Herodotus announced its existence as a powerful drug like wine in the 5th century BCE, it is highly unlikely that cannabis played no role in Greek culture of the classical period or even before. As with cannabis today, however, there would have been numerous popular names for it beyond the Scythian designation.
Part of the confusion regarding cannabis's role in ancient Greece is due to its use under a variety of names, as shall be discussed further by Ruck and Hillman, but it is also due to cannabis coming to Greece in the form of a finished product, either ground up into a powder, or, as Dr. Hillman suggests, a resin compound that was commonly mixed with other substances such as myrrh.
Actually, the ancient word for incense, murron, it doesn't mean myrrh. That's a big confusion in modern, that's a problem we have with, I think, the linguistics. We have to actually figure out what a lot of these ingredients are. So you have to find a reason to call it that. If there's no physical description, you can't call it. You can't just say, guess, it's this or that. So you want to identify it very, very, very precisely. Right? You want this. The stuff that comes from bacteria, it's always adulterated with this other stuff over here. The Arabs substitute myrrh. You know what they do? When they'll take a drug they'll take the rub, basically the hashish. They'll take the rub of the plant, the finest point when that resin, when that THC resin is its most intense time, they'll take that, right, and sell it as a drug. Well, if your drug comes through the shipping through Arabia, they adulterate it. And what do they adulterate it with? Myrrh. So you end up with these combinations of plants that actually end up together. Oh, all of a sudden myrrh and cannabis. You see them associated then more often. And they talk about this. Galen talks about which of these they call them sleep-inducing drugs. Right? Asterion is one of the sleep-inducing drugs. Ancient Greek temple complexes burned incense, and some of the incense that they burn has cannabis in it. Used in the complexes that worship Aphrodite or Deiceria. You see the same thing with Deiceria. And then we'll talk about the use of this incense, muron, which has now become so popularly used in the Mediterranean that it gets its own nickname, right? That's why you see muron.
Dr. Hillman believes the ritual use of cannabis in ancient Greece began with women, particularly regarding their worship of the goddess of love, Aphrodite, who is believed to have descended from more ancient Mideastern forms of the goddess, where the ritual use of cannabis has been documented with possibly related goddesses such as Ishtar, Hera, and the Canaanite Asherah. Hillman states the cannabis references in the cult of Aphrodite occurs under the name of Asterion, the star her, a name derived from the star-like shape of cannabis's leaves, and possibly for its otherworldly qualities as well.
Why do you want to go to Aphrodite in the ancient world? Because it's an oracular experience. And it starts with women. It all goes back to women and women's health. The cannabis is used primarily as a hygienic drug for the ancient world. And that in the process of treating women, you create things like oracles, and those oracles speak. And so using the cannabis is actually a way, in the Greek physician's mind, of playing the music that kind of heals the world. It's a very strange, the myth around cannabis is what's most beautiful, and this is what we miss out most of the time. The myth escapes us. So when they fumigated these plants, they didn't do a hotboxing fumigation. They fumigated them on that tripod, squat over that tripod into their vaginas, the place of absorption. And there are lots of creams that they're using and oils, and they're applying these oils vaginally. Okay.
Other cultural references to vaginal cannabis applications have been noted. More recently, a rash of magazine and website articles have been appearing proclaiming the wonders of cannabis-infused sexual lubricants. Witches used cannabis and other substances in ointments that were believed to have been applied vaginally with broomsticks, for instance.
So it sounds to us like this is odd and gross, but to them, the vagina is one of the roadways to moving a substance from one place into your body. They knew that you could eat it, but in some cases when you eat some poisons, they don't do anything, or they do really bad things. They knew this stuff. They were working with this stuff, and they developed so many different drugs, it's hard to follow all of the concoctions. It's very interesting. There's a biology that takes place when you look at the different plants that these priestesses are using, and it's just it's nature worship. So when you go see Aphrodite, it's a dream oracle. The temples of Aphrodite are dream oracles. So there's a ritual procedure there at the temple, and one of the things is you clean up, you bathe up. There's maybe a little fast before, then maybe some kind of dietary thing you do, and then you go see this oracle. And this oracle goes through a ritual performance, which is kind of a cleansing and catharsis itself, but it represents something to them. And she goes through the process of interacting with a sacramental substance that puts her into a state that she can speak as the voice of the god, because she is the highest beauty in the world. And you give her a jar of a resin, an offering for her to give to Aphrodite. And these offerings all have cannabis in them. Okay, so the stuff is all over the place. In Paphia, the temple burns 24 hours a day, every day of the year. That's its reputation. It's the one place in all of Greece that you can go and sit any time of the day or night in this vapor cloud of THC, marijuana. It's amazing. It's amazing.
In her book, The Cult of Divine Birth in Ancient Greece, Dr. Marguerite Rigoglosio has suggested that cannabis under the name Asterion was in use in the Greek cult of Hera, wife of Zeus, the supreme goddess of the Greek pantheon. As Marguerite Rigoglosio explains, historical references indicate that Hera's sacred site, the Argive Herion, was near the river Asterion, and along its banks grew the plant Asterion, cannabis. Rigoglosio claims the stalks and leaves of the plant were woven into garlands for decorating the statue of Hera at the site, and the plant itself was made as an offering to her. This is interesting in light of some images from the cult of Hera collected by David Malmo Levine, former owner and curator of the Herb Museum, that do indeed seem to depict cannabis-like leaves that will be discussed shortly.
My name is David Malmo Levine. I've been researching cannabis history for about 20 years now, and one of the things I like to do is look back in time and find images of cannabis leaves, potential cannabis leaves. And one of the areas that Chris has alerted me to is cannabis in the worship of the goddess Hera. There are a lot of images of Hera with leaves adorning her headdress or growing out of her head. You can see this in images of Hera as an incense burning altar. You also find cannabis leaves adorning a lot of architecture. You can see that basically right up to the 20th century architecture, this stylized tree of life image taken from the Sumerian and Assyrians. You also find cannabis leaves adorning incense altars themselves, and also on tombstones. And there's actually a scepter taken from what is believed to be possibly a priestess of Hera with cannabis at the tip, cannabis leaves at the tip, and also on a ring of these priestesses. But a lot of Greeks probably never saw the cannabis plant growing, so it's probable that these stylized leaves were copies of earlier architecture that they had come across, or else this is a method of hiding cannabis's true identity in a form of stylization.
In Greek myths, the lyre-playing poet hero Orpheus was said to have descended to the underworld in search of his deceased wife, Eurydice, who ended up there after being bitten by the proverbial snake in the grass. Although he failed to save his beloved, Orpheus returned from his sojourn in Hades with the secrets on which he based his system of initiation. From the 6th century BC onward, Orpheus was known as the founder of initiation. Unlike the placebo sacraments of later Christianity, the Orphic references to the ecstatic state of enthusiasmos, from where we get the word enthusiasm, was obviously produced by a powerful entheogen. Such ecstatic rites leave little wonder why Orphism competed with Christianity for popularity with the masses through the first few centuries AD. Orphics believed in reincarnation, teaching release from the sorrowful wheel of life through ascetic contemplation and astral projection type journeys, i.e. shamanic ecstasy. Orpheus's worship was believed to have originated in Thrace, where cannabis was utilized to induce a shamanic state 3,000 years ago. Interestingly, The Thracians worshipped Hera in their pantheon of deities, and we have discussed already Hera's cult's use of Asterion, the star herb. One of the rare times that cannabis was referred to by the name Cannabis in Greek literature occurred in a long-lost Greek tragedy, Thamyrias, by Sophocles. Unfortunately, no existing copies of the text exist, but the play and its references to cannabis are referred to in other existing ancient Greek documents. From what can be gathered, Thamyrias told the tale of a Thracian shaman singer who had a devil went down to Georgia-style musical battle with the muses, which he apparently lost, breaking his lyre in a fit of anger at the end. This is made less surprising by the fact that the people of this region were known to be closely related to the Scythian tribes, who we have discussed already for their ritual use of cannabis. The Thracians deeply influenced Greek culture in a number of ways, and such a technique of ecstasy among a group that held so much of an influence over Greek magical philosophies and religious traditions could hardly have gone unnoticed. The Thracian influence on Greek culture can be found by the Thracian origin of two figures prominent in Greek mythology, the god of intoxication Dionysus and the shaman prophet Orpheus, the founder of the mysteries.
You asked about Orphism, and one of the problems is that cannabis is often not called cannabis in our sources, and the most common way to refer to it was apparently smoke.
The most obvious ancient name for cannabis probably was simply smoke, kapnos. The smoke walkers, or Kapnobatai, were shamans who accessed a trance state by fumigation, most probably with cannabis fumes.
There were also Kapnomanteion, which was someone who was a prophet on smoke, and Kapnobatai, someone who was visionary with smoke. And it obviously refers to shamans who use kapnos, or smoke, entheogen, and this is probably cannabis.
As smoke, it lurks in the famous parody of Socrates in Aristophanes' Clouds comedy, 423 BCE.
The chorus in the Clouds is specifically designated as smoke.
More explicitly, clouds of smoke. It's specified.
And there's a joke involved there.
The philosopher was introduced on stage, hanging high in a basket, so that he can access his high thoughts as he summons his clouds of smoke beneath him. If he were not high, he could never have had his philosophical ideas.
They are clouds of smoke inhaling their own ethereal essence. Without that, they could never get high. The really interesting thing about this is public performance. It means that the whole audience in Athens know about kapnos smoke and that it gets you high.
Just before Socrates came swinging in high in his basket, his students were parodied as burning coals in his think shop. This is in the likeness of the Scythian cannabis fumigation tents, as they searched for the secrets of the mysteries. Herodotus had described this ritual in his history, which was current knowledge at the time of the Clouds comedy, with the historian just recently deceased. Herodotus had probably given public readings of his history in Athens. We have to remember that people didn't read. They could read, but there weren't any books, and reading was tedious. It was public performance, and Herodotus is known to have performed his history in Athens. He describes the Scythian cult of the dead, in which the men set up small teepee-like tents and creep inside, tossing cannabis onto red-hot coals in a brazier to produce a highly intoxicating fumigation that transported them to a state of ecstasy. The description fits perfectly the parody of Socrates' think shop. Inside the frontisterion of so-called wise souls are students who claim that the universe is like a covered incense burner or so-called choker, and we men are like the burning coals, punning on the word for men, anthropoi, in Cole's Anthrakes.
With regard to the Orphics, mostly the texts are misunderstood, but in Euripides' Hippolytus, he is portrayed as an Orphic, and his father tells him, since he is damning him, to go and worship the smoke of the Orphic books. People think that means he's to burn the books, but it's the smoke that's prescribed in the sacred texts, and it's being derided.
As the undisputed masters of healing herbs, at least according to the Greeks, the Thracians were no strangers to the shamanic techniques of ecstasy well known among cultures of the steppe. Strabo reported that the Mysians, a Thracian group from northwestern Anatolia, possessed members of their society called the Kapnobatai, those who walk in smoke. This reference to the walkers in smoke may allude to the ecstasy achieved by mass cannabis consumption, as reported by Herodotus among the Scythians. In the shamanic mystery initiations, as practiced by the Orphic cults, near-death experiences and the use of dangerous doses of hallucinogenic plants went hand in hand. Whereas the divine bridegroom Sabazios, a cognate of Dionysus, was primarily the god who presided over ecstasy and intoxication, the Thracians held him in equally high regard as a dying and rising savior god and a master over the souls of the deceased. Long before the introduction of alcohol, shaman exploited the ecstatic and oracular properties of hallucinogenic mushrooms, such as Amanita muscaria or various types of coprophytic psilocybin-containing mushrooms, opium, Jimson weed, thornapple, mandrake root, cannabis, deadly nightshade, and henbane. The experience of death and the ecstatic evacuation of the soul from the body appears commonly in the Thracian funeral iconography on which is depicted the Tree of Life. To be in a state of ecstasis, that is, to stand outside the body, was to experience death itself. It is both a physical and a symbolic self-sacrifice. These states were achieved through extended periods of fasting, dance and drumming, sleep deprivation, trials and ordeals, isolation and incubation, and the ritual consumption of these consciousness-altering substances, all of which were methods that could be, and often were, used in conjunction to elicit the ecstatic experience.
Cannabis would have been used by the Orphic mystics in order to induce mystical trance, which they interpreted as a journey out of the body to the outer reaches of the cosmos, to merge with the overmind, the composite intelligence of all life and intelligence that ever existed on the planet. The Scythians were neighbors of the Thracians, and the cult of Dionysus entered Greece through Thrace. It could not have been uninfluenced by the neighboring Scythians.
Dionysus was worshipped by some Scythian groups, as evidenced by a number of historical references and artifacts like the gilded silver Scythian dish with a feast of Dionysius on it from the State History Museum in Moscow.
You know, Thracian is a totally different language.
Yeah.
So it's not the Greek language, so the Greeks are trying to understand what the Thracians are doing. And they always kind of describe them in foreign terms. You know, like this is a very foreign culture to us. You know, it's not really. But then comes through Thrace Zagreus. And Zagreus, the worship of Zagreus, the Greeks said, now that we can understand. That we get. And the worship of Zagreus is the process of intoxication, ecstatic, menadic intoxication through different substances. And what are some of these substances? Well, look at what the god is surrounded by. What are the women? The formula is guarded. That's why Pentheus got executed, right? It was because he was trying to find out what they were doing.
About the wines being suffused with a variety of drugs, first of all, the wines could not have produced the intoxication, especially when diluted with water, that are documented. So it pretty much is accepted now that there were additives to the wine.
Cannabis was also commonly available as an additive to wine.
Dating back to the time of Alexander the Great, and possibly earlier, there has been an association between Dionysus and the Indian god of cannabis Shiva, whose relationship with the Indian drink prepared from cannabis, bhang, is very similar to that of Dionysus's with wine. Dionysus and Shiva share the same totem animals, the snake, tiger, and bull, as well as strong elements of phallic lingam worship. It was recorded by chroniclers traveling with Alexander the Great that when they invaded India, the followers of Dionysius and the Indian devotees of Shiva embraced each other as worshippers of the same god. Interestingly, as already noted, some Scythian groups were known to have at times worshipped Dionysus, and also, when Scythian groups had control over northern India, they turned to Shiva worship. I actually own a gold coin from the 2nd century A.D., which has a Scythian chieftain all dressed up in the regalia of Shiva, holding his trident and with a drug jar, thus the evidence that the mutual use of cannabis may have been another meeting point of the two gods and the cultures who worship them is not easily dismissed. Other infusions believed to contain hemp were attributed to Democritus and recorded by Pliny. As noted earlier, Bactria is the region where the Russian archaeologist Victor Sarianati found a football field-sized temple, where there is evidence of the large-scale production of cannabis, opium, and ephedra. Cannabis-infused wines were hugely popular throughout the ancient world, and references to them occur in the literature of the Persians, the Chinese, the Assyrians, Jews, and later Muslims, and in some cases the addition of myrrh, as with Democritus' preparation, was also included. Democritus was popularly known as the laughing philosopher for advocating a cheerful outlook and for his rhetorical use of irony and ridicule. and some have credited his use of a cannabis-infused wine to his cheery philosophical disposition. He was an influential pre-Socratic philosopher who formulated an atomic theory of the universe. Of his voluminous writings, only a few fragments of his ethical theory remain, with descriptions by other writers of his atomic theory. Cannabis-infused wines also bring to mind the mystical nepenthe. Nepenthe was a drug-infused wine the Egyptians were said to have used to ease the grieving of mourners for the dead. The Odyssey of Homer, written between the 9th and 8th centuries BC, describes the nepenthe which came to the Greeks from the Egyptian Thebes, a place Richard Evans Schultes, who was a professor of botany at Harvard University, and Dr. Albert Hofmann, chemist and inventor of LSD, claimed that cannabis was prepared into a drink in their monumental book, Plants of the Gods. Although some scholars have seen this as a reference to opiated wines, many others, going back more than 2 centuries, have suggested that this was a cannabis-infused wine, and an idea first put forth by the French pharmacist Joseph Farai, who suggested in 1813 that hashish was Homer's nepenthe. Many others have since concurred. Considering cannabis's already long-established association in the funerary rites of the Scythians and Thracians, and the effects indicated by the story, it is not surprising many have associated this preparation with cannabis. As the nepenthe was infused in wine and said to have originated in Egypt, it is important to note that Agent Amphora, claimed wine vessels from an Egyptian site from the time period in question, revealed evidence of cannabis.
So cannabis would have been known by other names. It's inconceivable that the Greeks wouldn't know about cannabis, since it's a common weed. And one of the names that I believe it was known as is thumbra. Its etymology comes from the verb to make smoke, and the making of smoke was the primary religious ritual for the Greeks. You burnt things. When Dioscorides identified the plants scientifically, he often was unaware of what plant he was identifying. He just used ancient names for plants that he was identifying. So he identified thumbra as thyme, and its botanical name, Latin name, is Thumbra saturea. So thumbra, the smoke plant, with the mythical involvement with satyrs. There is no reason why thyme should be involved with satyrs. About the satyrs don't exist. They're hybrid creatures that are part goat and are highly sexually active. They have an erect penis or phallus. But there are no such real creatures as goatmen in this reality. So they are obviously manifestations from another realm, which means that you encounter them when you're in a trance state. And as satyrs, they function as the sexual agent of the god, stimulating the maenads in their orgies on the mountain.
Significantly, the person who eats thumbra experiences altered vision. Seeing with the sight of a thumbra eater, which apparently means in a state of vision accessed by the herb.
The earliest reference to Thimbra is in the Odyssey, which is traditional oral poetry ascribed to Homer, which means that whatever is in the Homeric poem, which wasn't written down until the 8th century, is much, much older and comprised of things from various sources. So it can go very far back. And the Thumbra plant there is associated with the god Apollo in an episode in the Odyssey that involves lycanthropy, turning into a wolf.
Similar rituals are documented for the Nordic berserkers that turned into bears or wolves, became berserk, and had some kind of psychoactive sacrament, probably a Amanita muscaria.
There are two versions of Apollo, and one of them comes from the north and one from Anatolia. Both of them are associated with wolves, which means lycanthropy. And the god associated with cannabis is Apollo. If there's any god other than Dionysus, who's the antithesis of Apollo, who gets involved in cannabis symbolism, it would be Apollo in his manifestation as the wolf god. And as such, he is the patron of the Spartan army.
The soldiers cemented their allegiance to their Apollo wolf god and to their warrior fraternity with a cannabis ritual.
I believe the Spartan army had an initiation, or initiation involving cannabis fumigation, or that they prepared for battle by getting into a cannabis state.
The sexual and sight-altering connotations of the thumbra plant, as well as its association with satyriasis and Apolline lycanthropy, are clear indications that the plant is not Linnaeus's savory thyme, but savory is the way they translate satyr, savory thyme, but something psychoactive and fuming or smoky and capable of accessing shamanic animal transmogrification. Few plants are generally aphrodisiacs in actually stimulating the genitalia, but generally the euphoria of the trance state has orgasmic similarities, especially in the experience of imperial transport or chthonic oneness with the realm of Gaia.
Another potential foreign conduit for Greek cannabis use may come from the cult of Cybele, who was also popular in Thrace. Originally a Phrygian and Hittite goddess, Cybele's worship is believed to go back to Neolithic times in Anatolia, where she likely originated as a deification of Mother Earth. Her Roman equivalent was Magna Mater, or the Great Mother. Cybele's cult was popularized around the 5th century BC in Greece, where she was associated with the later cult of Dionysus, whom she was said to have purified and taught the mysteries. Cybele's originally Phrygian priests, known as Gallus or Galli, assumed women's clothing after a sacrificial castration, the gender transfers being a form of worship of the goddess by identification. In his Blossom of Bone, reclaiming the connections between homoeroticism and the sacred, Randy P. Connor refers to some Galli being awakened to this form of worship after ingesting a certain kind of herb growing along the banks of the Menandar River, as well as other acknowledged uses of mysterious sacraments among the cult. This is clear indication that they were practicing the common trait of mystery religions of the time, ingestion of entheogenic sacraments. Certain male functionaries of Sibyl's cult were known as canophori, which has usually been translated as reed-bearers, but linguistically, with cano and the phonetic similarity for cannabis in use among the Indo-European tribes, canna, this conceivably could have implications of cannabis bearers instead. Evidence of 8th century before Common Era hemp fabric show the Phrygian culture from which Sibyl's worship arose used cannabis. Similar cannabis-using transvestite worships of the goddess, known as Eneries, could be found amongst the Scythians, who worshipped Sibyl under the name Rhea, and who, as noted, held cultural ties to the Thracians as well. Like the Greek fates, Scythian Eneries were known to weave from a spindle while prophesying, likely with the fibers of the same plant that provided them with their prophetic inspiration. One can only speculate that weaving a tale and spinning a yarn may have some ancient relation to this tradition, or maybe it's just part of the hempen tale I am spinning here. The Scythian Eneries may have picked up their practice from the Galli or vice versa, or alternatively carried it on from an even earlier identical source. Similar practices among the worshippers of Near Eastern goddesses like Ishra, Ishtar, and Asherah, involving transvestite worshippers, cannabis, and in some cases, ritual weavings, have been noted. One can only speculate that these instances are representative of the same ancient widespread tradition, with varying local names and other differences. One last thing about Sibyl and her followers. They may have had need for a good herbal pain remedy at some of their festivals. Like the ancient counterpart of the gay pride parade, Sibyl's worshippers were said to have traveled from town to town, parading the image of their goddess on a chariot, banging cymbals and beating drums, dancing and singing, and also towing a cart with ritual knives and clamps, all used in religious rites of self-castration. As the story goes, while the festivities were taking place, young men who were uncomfortable with their gender would be taken up in the ecstasy of the celebration and moment and claim a knife and clamp from the cart, and then they would self-castrate themselves, throwing their detached testicles on some neighbor's doorway as a sort of blessing, and the unwitting homeowner would then be obliged to give the castrated devotee the attire of a woman, which they would then don, joining Sibyl's entourage on their journey from town to town.
In Greek mythology, the city of Delphi was the home of the Python, a giant serpent who terrorized humans. The legend says that the Greek god Apollo killed the Python, whose corpse then fell into a large crevice in the earth. Powerful vapors rose up from the crevice, causing hallucinations when they were inhaled. The people of Delphi believed the fumes came from the rotting corpse of the Python, and that they gave mortals a way to hear messages from Apollo. The people of Delphi built a shrine over the crevice and appointed a woman to inhale the vapors and communicate with Apollo on their behalf. This priestess was called the Pythia, after the decaying python underground. She also became known as the Oracle of Delphi.
There's a very important priestess in an oracular order at Delphi. And she is the priestess who has kind of the highest rank among these oracles. And this priestess is the one that kings consult when they want to really move and shake.
Deep within the temple of Apollo, a priestess sat waiting to be filled by the divine words of the god. She would fall into a trance, perhaps influenced by drugs. In a frenzy, she would call out jumbled responses. The attendant would record and transmit her answer.
The visionary priestess of Greece's oldest oracle, Delphi, was known as the Pythia, and was consulted on all matters of national importance until its closure in the 4th century AD by the prohibitions of the Christian emperor Theodosius, who left the sacred site to be later destroyed by rampaging Christian monks. Figured monuments show the Pythia in a calm, serene, concentrated state, sitting at a stool, breathing in fumes that arose from an open fissure in the floor that was believed to produce an ecstatic exaltation. By what means she attained this state has been a mystery scholars have debated for centuries.
Ancient records tell of mystical, sweet-smelling vapors rising from the earth, putting the Pythia under Apollo's spell. But while the reciting of prophecies is historical fact, questions about those vapors remain.
With a dissociative trance-like state produced from the vapors and the Thracian influence on the Delphic oracle, it has been conjectured that the Pythia likely put forth revelations from behind a veil of cannabis smoke that arose from a brazier beneath the floor, and this idea has been suggested by a variety of different sources. The late Professor C. Scott Littleton explored the possibility of cannabis use by the Pythia in his 1986 essay, The Pneuma Enthusiasticon, on the possibility of hallucinogenic vapors at Delphi and Dodona. When he wrote the Pneuma Enthusiasticon, Littleton noted that scrapings of residue from the site would go a long way to proving his hypothesis. I had the opportunity to talk and correspond with Professor Littleton at great length while I was writing my book, Cannabis in the Soma Solution, as Littleton was a recognized expert on Indo-European groups like the Scythians and the authors of the Vedas and Avesta. When I queried him on his effort to obtain a sample scraping from the site at Delphi, he lamented that he was forbidden from doing so.
Greek legend tells us that the site of Delphi itself was thought to possess a mystic power. Before the time of the oracle, the myth says, a herdsman following his goats into a rugged glen was suddenly overcome with visions of his future. The legends also claim that mysterious breezes and fragrances often fill the city.
Whether cannabis was evolved at Delphi, this is a problem because probably not, except as a common ingredient in incense in general. In the case of Delphi, the latest view is that the priestess inhaled fumes from a seismic vent in the temple, and so it's an ethylene gas.
Analysis of the bedrock beneath the temple also shows the existence of petrochemicals, including ethylene. Ethylene has been used as an anesthetic in modern days, but when administered in experimental small doses, induced a trance-like state.
And the trance state had a lot of similarities with the description of the Pythia there in the temple at Delphi.
Scholars think water running underground could have carried gases up through the fault lines, directly to the priestess.
The later discovery of evidence of ethylene gas at this site also led Professor Littleton to question the hypothesis he put forth in 1986, when the consensus then among geologists was that there were no naturally occurring fumes at Delphi or fissures for them to rise through. However, Littleton still regarded the possibility of cannabis in addition to the naturally occurring ethylene gas at Delphi, as has Professor Ruck in the general form of an incense that was commonly used at temple sites.
Also, as far as botanical sources are concerned, it documented that it's Daphne or the bay laurel, which may or may not be psychoactive. So it's not so clear, except in the general sense of sacred space being incense, that she got high from cannabis.
And depending on what kind of oracle is around, if it's a sleep oracle or if it's an Oracle of Delphi, they have different drugs for each one. And cannabis is all over the place as an incense.
Thus, evidence of the prophetic ecstasy brought on by the fumes of the giant serpent killed by Apollo at Delphi need not negate the use of cannabis as a stereon, the starry herb which spoke the language of the stars which set life's course.
But I'm told that at the Nekyomanteion in northwestern Greece, which was an entrance to the underworld at Acheron, they have found containers with residue of cannabis in them.
In regards to the find of cannabis residue at Acheron, Professor Ruck is referring to the discovery that was discussed in the 1982 book, The Mystery of the Oracles, by Philip Vandenberg. Vandenberg referred to the archaeologist Soterios Dicaris' find of hashish at the 4th and 3rd century Nekyomanteion, a place for consulting the dead on the River Acheron, one of the most famous entrances to the netherworld.
What is an oracle? We don't have these things sitting around today, so we don't understand the Greek way of thinking of it. An oracle is your closest contact to the gods. This is the gateway. You look at these oracles, we have them preserved. So here's what happens. You have a priestess, and somebody comes and goes through a ceremony of purification. You know, it's a bath. You buy your whatever supplies you need, and you take a bath. You present this stuff to the priestess. There's baking of cakes, burning them. There's a whole procedure for doing this stuff and what the cakes are shaped like and what they do. All of that stuff has asteria. And you have a dream oracle then. So this relaxes you. And you sit in the temple and ultimately you have a dream oracle. And there's the consistency across all of these oracles is that, these sleep oracles, is that you go in there, you use these substances that you're given, and you have a performance, a ritual performance. And so you can stand back and look at the substances and say, what are they doing? What are these things doing? So the girl on this night, she goes in the oracle and she burns the incense and she goes through the ritual purification, and all of this stuff has the THC in it, all of it.
This sort of temple sleep was a common method of religious experience throughout the ancient world, as referred to by Dr. Hillman. And his assessment is similar to that put forth by the 19th century scholar John Porter Brown almost a century and a half ago. Unfortunately, little can be found on Dicaris' alleged find of Greek hashish. James Weissman, in his review of Dicaris' work, omits any reference to hashish. Likewise, the Hellenic Mystery of Culture's internet page for this archaeological site makes no reference to these sacks of hashish. If there was such a find of ancient hashish, such censoring leads one to believe that here again we may find academic prejudice acting as a superstitious flaming cherubim blocking the way to historical fact. Professor Carl Ruck also tried to inquire about the evidence of this claim, and as a well-respected professor of classics, you would think he would be able to access it, but he was basically stonewalled as well.
I did contact the archaeologists to find out whether this was true or not, and it is a topic that Classis has found too hot to handle, so even though he was a friend, he never responded.
If reports of this find are indeed correct, then here in this Grecian temple we may have our oldest examples of hashish. Vandenberg still referred to Dicaris' find of Greek hashish in his 2007 edition of Mysteries of the Oracles, 25 years after the first publication. So one might conclude this claim holds and has simply been ignored for its historical relevance. The riddle-like oracles given by the Pythia at Delphi, discussed earlier, were deciphered by a priesthood that in times of corruption were said to have interpreted them to suit their own agendas. Pythagoras, who lived about 497 BC, the Greek philosopher and mathematician, reformed this priesthood through purifying rituals, and despite angry protests from the male priests, he went against tradition and initiated the female Pythia, Theocula. Pythagoras made influential contributions to philosophy and religion. He is often revered as a great mathematician, mystic, and scientist, and is best known for the Pythagorean theorem, which bears his name. Interestingly, the Book of Lists has Pythagoras first on a list of marijuana users. I've never been able to figure out what that was based on. However, Iamblichus referred to libations and sacrifices with fumigations and incenses being performed by Pythagoras and his initiates, and there has been some speculation about what was in these preparations. Commenting on the word frankincense, which means pure incense, aromatherapy expert Susan Fisher-Rizzi noted that we once called all herbs burnt as incense frankincense. A statement in tune with that Dr. Hillman referred to earlier in regards to Merion and the combination of cannabis and myrrh in temple incense plants. And these sorts of mixes in ancient Greece have also been referred to by botanist Professor William Bowden. That ancient incense plants sold at considerable cost as frankincense could have contained the highly aromatic and magically effective cannabis seems likely. Today, the word frankincense has come to specify the gum resin of the North African tree Boswellia, and Fisher-Rizzi and others have pointed out that this modern source also contains psychoactive properties, comparable in some ways to those of cannabis, and that its use in modern churches helps to instill chemically induced feelings of religious awe and well-being. The suggestion that Pythagoras received inspiration from cannabis was first put forth by the 19th century author and hashish experimenter Fitzhugh Ludlow, who suggested that elements like Pythagoras' hearing his name called out in the gurgling of a stream, along with taking on the identity of deities and other events, indicate, as in Ludlow's own experience with the drug, intoxication with hemp. Pythagoras based his system around the teachings of hemp using Thracian Orpheus, and he himself can clearly be described as a shaman, as Pythagoras had the ability to leave his body while in trance. Pythagoras, as with Democritus, who we discussed for his potential use of a cannabis-infused wine, traveled through Egypt, Ethiopia, Arabia, and Persia, visiting sects of psychoactive plant-using shaman priests known as magi, and he referred to the potent psychotropic sacraments which they used. Porphyry recorded that the Greek philosopher personally met the Persian shaman Zoroaster. It would be hard to believe that Pythagoras could have come into contact with these cultures and not been exposed to cannabis. Scholars have long noted Zoroaster's use of cannabis to achieve ecstasy, and the mythology around the Persian psychopomp shows that the others were initiated into its use, and in some cases, it was administered in wine like Democritus' preparation from Bacteria. The Chaldeans used kanabu, cannabis incense, ointments, and in ingested preparations. Recipes for cannabis incenses, regarded as copies of much older versions, were found in the cuneiform library of the legendary Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, and records from the time of his father, Esarhaddon, indicate cannabis, kanabu, was one of the main ingredients of the sacred rites. The Egyptians used topical cannabis medicines under the name Shemshemet, and possibly in wine preparations like the aforementioned nepenthe. And the Hebrews used cannabosum, now identified by a number of scholars as cannabis, in incenses, anointing oils, and also in infused wines, all of which is discussed at great length in my YouTube feature, Cannabosum, the Hidden Story of Cannabis in the Old Testament. Furthermore, it was used at these locations in a similar way to that being suggested here for these Greek oracular sites. Also of interest is that Pythagoras considered Abaris, a Scythian shaman who came to learn from him, so experienced that he didn't compel him to wade through the complicated introductory period involved with his teachings, but contrarily considered him fit to be an immediate listener to his doctrines and instructed him in the shortest possible way. Pythagoras' teachings were surrounded in secrecy, and his quick acceptance of the Scythian shaman Abaris may indicate that the mutual use of cannabis constituted a meeting point of some kind. It would be hard to believe, considering all this contact with cannabis-using cultures and his own practice of ritual fumigation, that Pythagoras would have missed this widespread and effective technique of shamanic ecstasy. Well, that about covers our odyssey into ancient Greece and its use of this magical plant. Unfortunately, much of what we discuss is left to speculation, and a discovery of actual cannabis, which is rare due to the fact that cannabis often decomposes over time, leaving little trace, and it takes very specific conditions for its preservation through time. A find like that of the alleged find of hashish at Acheron would go a long way to proving these theories. As has been mentioned a number of times in this discussion, there has been considerable academic disdain that also stands in the way of getting a clear understanding of the role of cannabis and other psychoactive substances in ancient Greece. And fortunately, as in the area of marijuana in medicine, these prejudices seem to be melting away, as can be seen in the closing comments of Professor Carl Ruck.
So what kind of reaction have you received about your research into drugs and religion, the cannabisum, academically and in the wider world?
Yeah, good question. I've outlived my enemies, and the tide is changing. The very same thing that I was not supposed to mention, I was solicited by my chairman to propose a course. I said, well, we'll call it something else. And he said, no, call it Entheogens and Human Consciousness. And so it went before the committee, which quibbles about everything, whether it was going to be accepted as a university course. And it was accepted. And so now they want me to teach that. And the fact that classical scholars ignored the work on the Thyrsus and the Narthex and the monadic ritual has turned around too, because there are new scholars now in Greece, northern Greece in particular, in Bulgaria, and we're organizing conferences, and they are indeed saying, yes, there were mushrooms, there was cannabis, it was an ecstatic religion, and it goes way back.
If you found this documentary of interest, check out some of my other videos on YouTube, and if you want to support this type of research and learn more, pick up a copy of my book, Cannabis and the Soma Solution, which covers much of the material discussed in this presentation, as well as detailing the role of cannabis in a wide range of ancient cultures and religions. Thank you very much. I am Chris Bennett, and this has been Burning Shiva.